Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Harrison, Arkansas. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The name Harrison, Arkansas seldom appears in history books discussing the most unsettling events of the American frontier. Yet, in the shadows of the Ozark Mountains, beneath the veneer of a growing settlement, lies a tale so deeply disturbing that local historians have largely relegated it to whispered conversations and dusty archives. What happened in 1857 between the Mason brothers and the quiet community they ultimately destroyed remains one of the most psychologically devastating series of events ever documented in Boone County. The story I'm about to share with you has been pieced together from courthouse records, newspaper clippings from the Arkansas Gazette, personal correspondence, and testimonies that were sealed until 1963, when a courthouse renovation accidentally uncovered a box of documents that many believe should have remained buried. The year was 1857. Harrison was still a young settlement, having been established just a few years prior as the seat of the newly formed Boone County. The town sat nestled in the rolling hills of the Ozarks, with Crooked Creek winding through the eastern edge of the settlement. It was a place of promise for many settlers looking to establish themselves in the growing American frontier before the tensions that would soon erupt into civil war. Among those drawn to the opportunity was a pair of brothers, Edmund and Thomas Mason. They arrived in early spring with a modest wagon of possessions, 2 fine horses, and enough money to purchase one of the larger properties on the outskirts of town, a 2-story farmhouse with 20 acres that had belonged to the recently deceased Jeremiah Hollister, a founding member of the community who had no living relatives to claim his estate. According to the town records, the Masons presented themselves as businessmen from Philadelphia who had decided to seek new opportunities in the growing Western territories. Edmund, the elder at 32, possessed a commanding presence. Standing over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a precisely trimmed beard, he spoke with the refined accent of someone educated in the finest Eastern institutions. Thomas, 5 years younger, was slighter in build, quieter, and seemed to defer to his brother in all matters of business and social interaction. From the beginning, something about the brothers struck the townsfolk as peculiar, though none could articulate precisely what caused their unease. The Masons were unfailingly polite, attended church services at the newly constructed Methodist chapel, and made generous donations to local causes. Yet there was a certain reserve about them, a carefully maintained distance that prevented true familiarity. They smiled with their mouths, but never with their eyes, recalled Sarah Pemberton, wife of the town blacksmith, in a journal entry dated July 1857, and they never seemed to disagree with one another, not even in the smallest matters, which struck me as unnatural between brothers. The Masons quickly established themselves within the community's upper echelon. Edmund, with his business acumen, proposed several ventures that promised to bring prosperity to Harrison. He spoke of connections to Eastern investors, of plans for a sawmill that would provide lumber for the growing settlement, and of establishing regular trade routes to St. Louis. Thomas, meanwhile, demonstrated a remarkable talent for bookkeeping, and was soon assisting the town clerk with organizing municipal records. By summer, the brothers had become fixtures in Harrison's small society. They hosted dinners at their farmhouse for the town's prominent families, though, curiously, no one was ever invited upstairs or into certain rooms that remained perpetually locked. When questioned about this, Edmund would smile thinly and explain that some rooms contained valuable business documents and items from their family estate that required special care. "The house has a peculiar atmosphere," wrote Judge William Thornton after attending one such dinner in August. "Despite the fine furnishings and excellent meal, I found myself eager to leave once the sun had set. There is a stillness within those walls that seems to absorb sound rather than allow it to echo." The first indication that something was amiss came in late August, when a traveling salesman named Oliver Jenkins arrived in Harrison. During a conversation at the town's only hotel, Jenkins expressed surprise at encountering the Mason brothers so far west, remarking that he had known of them in Baltimore, not Philadelphia, as they had claimed. When word of this discrepancy reached the Masons, Edmund quickly explained that they had indeed lived briefly in Baltimore before Philadelphia, and that Jenkins must have confused their timeline. The explanation was accepted without much question, particularly when the following day Jenkins abruptly departed town without completing his planned week of sales. He left before dawn, reported the hotel proprietor, paid his bill in full, but seemed in an unusual hurry. Left some of his sample cases behind, which was most irregular for a man in his profession. Those sample cases were eventually claimed by Edmund Mason, who explained that Jenkins had asked him to forward them to his next destination. No one questioned this, just as no one questioned when the Masons began to expand their property, purchasing adjacent land and constructing a high wooden fence around the perimeter. As autumn approached, a series of strange occurrences began to trouble the town. Livestock went missing from farms neighboring the Masons' property. Unusual sounds were reported in the night, sounds that some described as mechanical grinding, others as pained moaning. Most disturbing were the accounts from those who passed the Mason property after dark and claimed to have seen lights moving within the woods behind the house, lights that seemed to hover without the support of lanterns or torches. These oddities might have remained merely the subject of local gossip had it not been for the arrival of Dr. James Whitman in early October. A physician from New York, Whitman had come to Harrison seeking a quieter practice after years in the crowded city. During his first social gathering, a harvest celebration hosted by the mayor, Whitman was introduced to the Mason brothers. Those who witnessed the introduction later described a chilling moment of recognition. Upon hearing Edmund Mason's name, Dr. Whitman's face drained of color. He excused himself immediately and was observed engaged in an intense conversation with the town sheriff shortly thereafter. The following morning, Sheriff Harlan Richardson paid an official visit to the Mason property. What transpired during that visit was never fully documented, but Richardson emerged visibly shaken. He returned to his office and immediately dispatched urgent messages to authorities in Philadelphia, Baltimore, and New York. For 3 days, an uneasy calm settled over Harrison. The Masons continued their daily routines, though observant townsfolk noted that Thomas appeared increasingly agitated, while Edmund maintained his usual composed demeanor. They were seen purchasing large quantities of supplies, enough to sustain a household through several months, and making arrangements with the local bank regarding their accounts. On the 4th day, a response to the sheriff's inquiries arrived from Baltimore. The contents of that message were not made public, but within hours, Sheriff Richardson assembled a group of 10 men and returned to the Mason property with the intention of bringing the brothers in for questioning. They found the house empty. What they discovered inside, however, would haunt the community for generations to come. The locked rooms that no guest had ever entered contained evidence of an elaborate deception. Stacks of correspondence revealed that the men calling themselves Edmund and Thomas Mason were not brothers at all, nor were they from Philadelphia. Their real names were Elias and Theodore Blackwood, and they had been business partners in Baltimore, where they had operated a fraudulent investment scheme that had ruined dozens of families. But this was merely the beginning of the horror. In the cellar, behind a false wall constructed with remarkable craftsmanship, the search party discovered a small room containing personal effects belonging to at least 7 individuals who had passed through Harrison in the months since the Masons' arrival, including those of Oliver Jenkins, the traveling salesman who had departed so suddenly. Most disturbing was a leather-bound ledger in which Edmund had kept meticulous notes, not of business transactions, but of conversations, habits, and weaknesses of prominent Harrison residents. Each entry concluded with a detailed plan for leveraging these weaknesses for financial gain, or in some cases, for punishment of perceived slights. The level of observation and calculation was described by Judge Thornton as a cold-blooded analysis of human frailty by a mind utterly devoid of compassion. Sheriff Richardson also discovered a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards of Edmund's study containing several journals. These were not ordinary diaries, but rather detailed accounts of psychological experiments Edmund had conducted throughout his life. The earliest entry dated back to 1842, describing his first attempts at manipulating the perceptions of others. Today, I succeeded in convincing Mr. Hargrove that he had agreed to sell me his pocket watch for half its value, the entry read. Though he initially protested, after 20 minutes of calm insistence on my part, referencing conversations we never had, he began to doubt his own recollection. By the end, he apologized to me for his confusion and handed over the watch, thanking me for my patience. The journals grew more disturbing with each passing year, documenting Edmund's refined techniques of psychological manipulation. He had developed what he called the art of reality reconstruction, a systematic approach to breaking down a person's confidence in their own memories and perceptions, replacing them with alternate versions that served his purposes. The human mind, he wrote in an entry from 1851, is not the fortress most believe it to be. It is rather a palace built on shifting sand. One need only create enough doubt in the foundation for the entire structure to become unstable. Once a man begins to question his own memories, he becomes desperate for solid ground. It is in this moment of desperation that I provide my version of reality, a seemingly firm surface upon which he can rebuild his understanding of the world. Among the most chilling discoveries was a map of Harrison on which Edmund had marked the homes of various residents with cryptic notations. Certain households were circled in red ink with dates written beside them, dates that had not yet arrived. Sheriff Richardson would later testify that it appeared to be a schedule of some kind, a planned sequence of activities that, thankfully, was interrupted by our investigation. The search for the fugitives began immediately. Riders were dispatched in all directions, and telegrams were sent to every settlement within 100 miles. For weeks the hunt continued, but no trace of the men was found. It was as if they had simply vanished into the vast wilderness surrounding Harrison. Then, in late November, a startling development occurred. Thomas Mason, or Theodore Blackwood, was found wandering on the outskirts of Fayetteville, some 40 miles southwest of Harrison. His clothes were tattered, his feet bare and bloody, and his mind apparently shattered. He was brought back to Harrison and held in a secured room at the hotel, as the town had no proper jail at that time. For days Thomas said nothing coherent, merely staring at the wall and occasionally muttering what sounded like prayers or pleas. When he finally began to speak intelligibly, what he revealed was so disturbing that many refused to believe it. According to the transcript of his statement preserved in the county records, Thomas claimed that he and Edmund had never been business partners or brothers. Instead, he insisted that he had been Edmund's prisoner for years, forced to participate in his schemes through a combination of threats, manipulation, and some form of psychological control that he struggled to articulate. "He has a way of speaking that changes what you know to be true," Thomas reportedly said. "He would stand behind me while I slept and whisper things I would later believe were my own thoughts. I have memories I know cannot be mine, yet they feel more real than my actual past." Thomas recounted how Edmund had selected Harrison after careful research, identifying it as a community wealthy enough to be worth targeting, but isolated enough that outside communication was limited. Their plan had been to ingratiate themselves with the town's elite, manipulate land deals and business ventures to their advantage, and eventually abscond with as much wealth as they could accumulate. But the most chilling aspect of Thomas's confession concerned the fate of those who had disappeared after encountering the Masons. According to Thomas, Edmund had developed an obsession with understanding the nature of deception and its effect on the human mind. He had conducted what he called experiments on those who had somehow threatened their scheme or who had simply presented convenient opportunities. He would tell them stories, elaborate, convincing narratives that contradicted their own memories, Thomas explained, and he would continue until they began to doubt themselves, until they could no longer distinguish between what they knew and what he told them. He called it rewriting the past. Some broke quickly, others resisted. Those were the ones he found most valuable. Thomas described in horrifying detail how Edmund would isolate his subjects in the cellar room, keeping them in conditions designed to disorient. Irregular meals, constant low noise, and limited light that made it impossible to track the passage of time. Edmund would then begin what he called the unmaking process, systematically dismantling the subject's sense of identity through a combination of sleep deprivation, contradictory information, and psychological pressure. He would enter the room with absolute confidence and inform them that they were not who they believed themselves to be, Thomas said. He would provide alternative histories backed by manufactured evidence, letters they had supposedly written, possessions they allegedly owned, testimonies from Confederates who claimed to have known them in their real lives. At first, they would resist, clinging to their true memories, but Edmund was patient. He would simply nod and say, "You'll remember soon enough," and leave them to contemplate the doubt he had planted. According to Thomas, the process typically took between 2 and 6 weeks, depending on the subject's mental resilience. Some never fully surrendered their original identities and were, Thomas believed, disposed of during night journeys into the Ozark wilderness, though he claimed to have no direct knowledge of their ultimate fate. Others, however, eventually capitulated entirely to Edmund's alternative reality. When they finally accepted Edmund's version of their past, the relief was visible, Thomas recalled. It was as if they had been drowning and had finally found something to cling to, even if that something was a complete fabrication. Edmund would then begin the reconstruction phase, building a new identity that served his purposes. Most disturbing was Thomas's claim that some of Edmund's reconstructed subjects had been released back into society, not just in Harrison, but in communities throughout the region. These individuals, their original identities, erased and replaced with personas loyal to Edmund, served as his agents, gathering information and influencing local affairs according to his instructions. He called them his echoes, Thomas said. People who would repeat whatever reality he had given them, reinforcing his narratives and extending his influence far beyond his physical presence. Some don't even know they're serving him. They simply act according to the motivations and beliefs he implanted in them, thinking these thoughts are their own. When asked about the current whereabouts of Edmund, Thomas became agitated. He claimed that Edmund had not fled but had merely changed his story and was still in Harrison, possibly living as one of its respected citizens. This assertion was initially dismissed as the ravings of a broken mind, particularly when Thomas was unable to identify which townsperson might actually be Edmund in disguise. Nevertheless, the possibility was too disturbing to ignore entirely. Sheriff Richardson ordered a discreet accounting of every man in Harrison, seeking to verify the background of any who had arrived within the past year or whose behavior had noticeably changed in recent months. This investigation led to a period of intense paranoia within the community. Neighbors regarded each other with suspicion. Long-standing friendships fractured under the weight of doubt. Some families chose to leave Harrison altogether rather than live with the constant uncertainty. The town council convened an emergency meeting to address the growing crisis. During heated discussions that lasted well into the night, proposals ranged from requiring all residents to provide documented proof of their identities to implementing a strict curfew and restricting travel in and out of the settlement. Judge Thornton, normally a voice of measured reason, suggested that the town might need to temporarily isolate itself from outside contact until Edmund could be apprehended and the full extent of his deception uncovered. We find ourselves in the extraordinary position, Thornton said, according to the meeting minutes, of being unable to trust the evidence of our own senses or the testimony of our neighbors. Until we can establish with certainty who among us is who they claim to be, we must proceed with the utmost caution in all matters. The council ultimately decided on a compromise approach. Travel would not be restricted, but all residents were asked to voluntarily submit to interviews with the sheriff and provide any available documentation of their identities and histories. Additionally, a night watch was established with trusted men patrolling the streets after dark, ostensibly to protect against external threats, but in reality to monitor the movements of the townspeople themselves. By mid-December, Thomas's mental state had deteriorated further. He alternated between periods of catatonia and frenzied terror, often claiming that Edmund was standing in his room, though no one else could see him. The town doctor administered laudanum to calm him, but this only seemed to intensify his delusions. On the night of December 18th, during a severe winter storm that had confined most residents to their homes, Thomas somehow escaped his guarded room. Despite the blizzard conditions and a temperature well below freezing, he fled into the night wearing only a nightshirt. A search party was organized once the storm abated, but no trace of him was found save for a single bloody footprint on the bridge over Crooked Creek. It was widely assumed that Thomas had perished in the storm or the frigid waters of the creek. With his disappearance, the immediate crisis seemed to have passed, yet the damage to Harrison's social fabric was already done. The trust that had bound the community had been irreparably damaged. In the months that followed, Harrison attempted to return to normalcy. The Mason property was eventually sold at auction, the proceeds held in trust for any victims of the brothers' schemes who might come forward. The high fence was torn down, the house renovated and occupied by a new family who claimed to experience no unusual phenomena despite the property's grim history. However, the psychological wounds inflicted on the town proved harder to heal than its physical spaces. Throughout 1858, Harrison experienced a slow exodus of residents, many citing business opportunities elsewhere, but privately admitting their inability to feel secure in a place where such elaborate deception had occurred. In March of that year, a disturbing incident reignited fears that had only just begun to subside. During Sunday services at the Methodist Chapel, an elderly woman named Elizabeth Carver suddenly stood during the sermon and declared that half the congregation were not who they claimed to be. Pointing at various respected community members, she insisted that they had different faces just months before. Carver was quickly escorted outside, her outburst attributed to confusion brought on by age. Yet her accusations rekindled the embers of suspicion that had never fully died out. The following week, Jonathan Pierce, a farmer whose property adjoined the former Mason estate, reported hearing voices in his fields at night, voices engaged in conversations that made no sense, discussing people and events he did not recognize. When he investigated with lantern and rifle in hand, he found nothing, yet the voices continued on subsequent nights, always just beyond the reach of his light. These incidents might have been dismissed as the product of overwrought imaginations had it not been for a discovery made by Sheriff Richardson in late April. While reviewing town records as part of his ongoing investigation, Richardson noticed subtle discrepancies in documents filed after the Masons' arrival, changes in handwriting, altered formats, missing pages that had been noted in the indexes but were no longer present. Most concerning were amendments to property deeds that subtly shifted land boundaries or modified ownership terms in ways that would only become apparent years later. It appears, Richardson wrote in his official report, that the corruption of our community extended beyond mere social deception. The very records upon which our legal and civic order depends have been systematically compromised, creating a legacy of confusion and potential conflict that may not fully manifest for a generation. This revelation led to a painstaking review of all official documents created or modified during the Masons' time in Harrison. The process revealed dozens of irregularities, many seemingly inconsequential, but others with potentially significant long-term implications for property rights, business arrangements, and even family lineages as recorded in church registries. Perhaps the most disturbing postscript to this tale emerged in early 1859, when Sheriff Richardson, who had led the investigation, received a letter postmarked from San Francisco. The contents were never officially disclosed, but Richardson resigned his position the following day and departed Harrison without explanation. His replacement, upon reviewing the case files, discovered that several key documents, including Thomas's full confession and the detailed ledger, had vanished from the locked cabinet where they had been stored. Rumors circulated that Richardson himself had been one of Edmund's echoes, a man whose original identity had been erased and replaced with one that served Edmund's purposes. Whether he had always been such, or whether the letter from San Francisco had somehow triggered a dormant alternate personality, remains a matter of speculation. What is certain is that Richardson was never seen in Boone County again. In the summer of 1859, a series of unusual deaths occurred among those who had been most deeply involved in investigating the Mason brothers. Judge Thornton suffered a sudden brain fever that left him confined to his bed for weeks. Upon recovery, he claimed no memory of the Mason case and expressed confusion when it was mentioned to him. The town clerk, who had worked closely with Thomas, was found dead in his office, apparently having ingested a poisonous herb that grew in the surrounding hills. An accident, according to the official report, though some noted that the man had been an experienced forager who would never have mistaken a toxic plant for an edible one. By 1860, as the nation's attention turned increasingly to the looming specter of civil war, the Mason incident began to fade from public discourse in Harrison. It became a chapter of local history that was acknowledged but rarely discussed in detail, a collective trauma too painful to examine directly. New residents who arrived after the events were given only vague accounts, if told anything at all. For decades, the story of the Mason brothers faded from public discussion in Harrison, becoming a shameful chapter that older residents preferred not to revisit. It might have been forgotten entirely had it not been for the courthouse renovation of 1963, which uncovered a sealed wall compartment containing a collection of papers that appeared to be the missing documents from the original investigation, along with subsequent correspondence that shed new light on the case. Among these papers was a letter dated 1886 from a man claiming to be Thomas Mason. In it he confessed that the entire narrative he had presented in 1857 was a fabrication, another layer of deception crafted by him and Edmund to confuse authorities and enable their escape. According to this account, both men had successfully fled to California during the confusion, amassing considerable fortunes during the later gold rushes before parting ways in the 1870s. Our time in Harrison, the letter stated, was merely a rehearsal for greater deceptions to come. The techniques we refined there, the manipulation of records, the erosion of trust, the creation of alternative histories, proved invaluable in our subsequent endeavors. What the good people of Harrison never understood was that we chose their community not for its wealth, which was modest at best, but for its isolation and the strength of its social bonds. It presented the ideal laboratory for our experiments in what might be called social decomposition, the systematic dismantling of the invisible ties that bind a community together. The letter went on to describe how Edmund had developed his theories of psychological manipulation through years of careful study and experimentation. He had been particularly interested in the phenomenon of false memory, the human tendency to remember events that never occurred or to recall them in ways that differed significantly from reality. This natural fallibility, Edmund had discovered, could be exploited and amplified through specific techniques of suggestion and reinforcement. The human mind, the letter explained, abhors inconsistency above all else. When presented with contradictory information about its own past, it will work tirelessly to construct a coherent narrative, even if that narrative must be largely invented. Edmund's genius lay in recognizing that this reconstructive process could be guided by an external hand, that with the right pressure applied at the right moments, a person could be led to replace their authentic memories with prefabricated ones that better served our purposes. Most disturbing was the letter's claim that the Mason brothers had never intended to limit their experiment to Harrison alone. What we achieved in that small community was merely a prototype, the writer asserted. The methods we developed there have since been applied on a much grander scale, in business, in politics, in the very shaping of how Americans understand their collective history. The residents of Harrison believed the nightmare ended with our departure. In truth, it merely expanded beyond the boundaries of their perception. The letter concluded with a passage that continues to disturb those who study this case. The greatest satisfaction was not in the wealth we acquired, but in creating a legacy of distrust that would continue long after our departure. A community built on faith in one's neighbors is easily dismantled when that faith is shown to be misplaced. I often wonder how many times the good people of Harrison looked at their friends and family in the years following our visit, and momentarily wondered if they were truly who they claimed to be. It is in these small moments of doubt, multiplied across countless interactions, that our true victory lies. For once trust is broken, it can never be fully restored. It becomes instead a thing constantly questioned, constantly tested, and therefore never complete. The authenticity of this letter has been debated by historians. Some believe it to be genuine, while others suggest it may have been planted as a final twist in an already convoluted deception. What remains undisputed is the profound effect the Mason brothers' presence had on Harrison, a community that had been fundamentally altered by the realization that those we believe we know may be performing the most elaborate of deceptions. In the years following the discovery of these documents, several researchers attempted to trace the subsequent activities of Edmund and Thomas Mason. These investigations yielded tantalizingly incomplete results. There are records of men using similar names in San Francisco during the 1860s involved in banking and real estate ventures that generated substantial profits. However, the descriptions of these individuals vary widely in contemporary accounts, suggesting either multiple people using the same identities or, more disturbing, individuals capable of so thoroughly transforming their appearance and mannerisms as to be unrecognizable to those who had previously known them. One researcher, Professor Martin Holbrook of the University of Arkansas, dedicated much of his career to studying the Mason case. In a monograph published in 1965, he proposed that Edmund Mason may have been one of the earliest documented cases of what modern psychology would term a sociopathic personality with extraordinary intelligence and manipulative abilities. What makes the Mason case so disturbing, Holbrook wrote, is not merely the harm done to a specific community at a specific time, but the implications it holds for our understanding of identity and social trust. If Edmund Mason could so thoroughly corrupt the fabric of reality for an entire town, and potentially beyond, what does this suggest about the fragility of our shared understanding of the world? In 1965, an elderly woman named Margaret Fulton, who had been a young adult in Harrison during the 1850s, gave her final interview to a local historical society. When asked about the Mason brothers, her response was recorded as follows: "The worst thing wasn't what they did while they were here. It was what remained after they were gone, the suspicion, the doubt. Edmund once told my father at a dinner that the most valuable commodity in the world wasn't gold or land, but trust. Once you possess a person's trust, he said, you own everything they have without them even realizing it's been taken." I didn't understand what he meant then. I'm not certain any of us truly understood until it was far too late. She went on to describe how, in the years following the Mason incident, Harrison had become a community where nothing was taken at face value. Business agreements that would once have been sealed with a handshake now required extensive written documentation. New arrivals to town were subjected to subtle but thorough scrutiny before being accepted into local society. Even long-standing residents found themselves occasionally questioned about details of their past, casual inquiries that masked deeper concerns about whether they were truly who they had always claimed to be. The Masons infected us with doubt, Fulton concluded, and that infection spread from person to person, generation to generation, until it became part of the character of the town itself. We became people who smiled and nodded and went about our business, all while wondering what secrets might lie behind the familiar faces of our neighbors. The house that once belonged to the Mason brothers still stands in Harrison today, though it has been significantly remodeled over the generations. The current owners report no unusual occurrences, and most tourists who visit the historic district remain unaware of the property's dark history. Yet, local residents still occasionally speak of strange phenomena, not supernatural hauntings, but something perhaps more unsettling. Visitors to Harrison sometimes report encounters with extremely convincing strangers who seem to know intimate details about their lives, who engage them in deep conversations that leave them questioning long-held beliefs or memories. These encounters are typically dismissed as coincidences or misunderstandings. However, one detail often emerges in these accounts that gives even skeptics pause. The strangers, regardless of apparent age or appearance, are frequently described as smiling only with their mouths, never with their eyes. In the archives of Boone County, accessible to serious researchers with proper credentials, the Mason case remains one of the most requested files, though many who study it report a curious effect, a growing sense of doubt about their own memories and perceptions that persists long after they've returned the documents to their folders. Dr. Eleanor Walsh, a psychologist who reviewed the case in 1972, noted that the records themselves seem to exert a subtle influence on those who examined them. There is something in the detailed accounting of Edmund Mason's methods, she wrote in her field notes, that makes one begin to question the reliability of one's own mind. After several days of reading his journals, I found myself doubting memories I had always trusted implicitly. It was as if the very act of studying his techniques of manipulation made me more vulnerable to them even across the span of a century. This observation led Walsh to propose what she called the Mason effect, the idea that certain forms of psychological manipulation can transcend direct personal interaction, embedding themselves in narratives, documents, and cultural memories in ways that allow them to influence individuals who encounter these materials long after their original creation. If this hypothesis is correct, she wrote, then Edmund Mason may have achieved something far more significant than the mere deception of a frontier town. He may have discovered a method of extending his influence across time itself. The final piece of this disturbing puzzle came to light in 1968, when an archaeological survey of the area behind the former Mason property uncovered the foundation of a previously unknown structure, a small outbuilding that appeared to have been deliberately buried. Inside were found several items of personal significance, including a pocket watch, wedding bands, and other effects that were eventually linked to individuals who had been reported missing during the period of the Masons' residence in Harrison. Most intriguing among these artifacts was a small mechanical device of unknown purpose, consisting of a series of interlocking brass gears and a hand crank. It appeared to be designed to produce a specific pattern of clicks and pauses when operated. Experts who examined the device speculated that it might have been used in Edmund's psychological experiments, perhaps as a means of marking time for subjects kept in isolation, or as a metronome-like device to pace his verbal manipulations during interrogation sessions. No human remains were ever discovered, leaving open the question of what ultimately happened to those who disappeared. This absence has led some researchers to suggest that the most terrifying possibility may be true, that the victims did not die, but were somehow transformed, their identities erased and replaced through the brothers' psychological manipulations, then released back into the world as unwitting agents of the same deception that had claimed them. The official record states only that, due to the historical nature of the crimes and the presumed death of all involved parties, no further investigation is warranted. Yet for those who have studied this case in depth, the most disturbing question remains unanswered. If Edmund Mason was as skilled at manipulation and disguise as the evidence suggests, and if he took such pleasure in sowing distrust, is it not possible that he or his methods might have persisted in Harrison long after his supposed departure? The case was officially closed in 1969, with the findings sealed in the state archives in Little Rock. This question takes on additional significance when one considers the letter discovered in the courthouse wall, a letter supposedly written by Thomas Mason nearly 30 years after the events in Harrison. If authentic, it suggests not only that the brothers escaped justice, but that they continued to refine and apply their techniques of deception on an ever larger scale. And if the letter is a forgery, perhaps planted decades after the fact by someone seeking to perpetuate the legend of the Mason brothers, then it represents a different but equally disturbing possibility: that Edmund's methods of manipulation have been adopted and adapted by others, creating a legacy that extends far beyond his own lifetime. In either case, the implications for our understanding of truth, memory, and identity are profound. The Mason case challenges our most basic assumptions about the reliability of our own perceptions and the authenticity of our social connections. It suggests that the reality we experience is far more malleable and far more vulnerable to deliberate manipulation than we might care to acknowledge. Some in Harrison still lock their doors not against any physical threat, but against the more insidious danger of a stranger's persuasive words. And on quiet nights, when the wind blows down from the Ozarks and through the streets of the now prosperous town, some still report hearing what sounds like a whisper. The story you believe is the one I chose for you to believe. Perhaps the most fitting epitaph for this disturbing chapter in Harrison's history comes from the journal of Judge Thornton, who wrote in his final entry before his death in 1860, "The true horror of the Mason incident lies not in what we discovered, but in what remains undiscovered, the seeds of doubt they planted that continue to grow in the shadows of our minds. I find myself studying the faces of men I have known for decades, searching for signs that they are not who I have always believed them to be. And in doing so, I realize that Edmund has achieved his greatest victory. He has made me doubt not just others, but myself." The Mason brothers never faced justice in any courtroom, but their legacy of psychological devastation constitutes a punishment they inflicted not on themselves, but on an entire community, a punishment that, in some subtle ways, continues to this day in the collective memory and lingering paranoia of a town that learned the hard price of trust betrayed. This historical account raises uncomfortable questions that extend far beyond the specific events of 1857. If two men could so thoroughly undermine the social fabric of an entire community through calculated deception, what might be possible in our modern age of mass communication and digital technology? If Edmund Mason could implant false memories and alternate histories through nothing more than skillful conversation and fabricated documents, how much more vulnerable might we be to similar manipulations enhanced by contemporary tools and techniques? There is evidence suggesting that Edmund Mason maintained correspondence with various academics and scientists of his era, particularly those interested in the emerging field of psychology. Several letters discovered among his effects indicated an awareness of early research into hypnosis, suggestion, and memory formation. He appeared to view himself not merely as a con man, but as a pioneering researcher, albeit one whose experiments violated all ethical boundaries. "The common criminal seeks material gain," he wrote in one such letter, addressed to a professor at Harvard whose name has been redacted from the public record. I seek something far more valuable, knowledge of how reality itself is constructed in the human mind, and how that construction might be directed by one who understands its architecture. In the decades following the Mason incident, several academic papers were published in obscure journals discussing techniques of reality reconstruction that bore striking similarities to those described in Edmund's journals. These papers, authored under various names that have proven impossible to trace to real individuals, presented his methods as theoretical frameworks rather than accounts of actual manipulation. They circulated primarily among specialists in psychology and philosophy of mind, attracting little attention from the broader scientific community or the public. Yet their influence appears to have been significant in certain circles. Dr. Walsh, in her investigation of the Mason case, discovered references to these papers in the private correspondences of several individuals later associated with early propaganda efforts, advertising psychology, and interrogation techniques. There is a direct lineage, she wrote, from the methods developed by Edmund Mason in the isolation of frontier America to modern systems of mass persuasion and psychological influence. The seeds planted in Harrison have borne fruit in ways that would likely have delighted their original cultivator. This assessment gains disturbing weight when one considers the final paragraph of the purported Thomas Mason letter from 1886. As I approach the end of my life, I find a certain satisfaction in knowing that Edmund's work continues, though he himself has been gone these many years. His methods have been adopted, often unwittingly, by those who shape public opinion, who craft the narratives that nations tell themselves about who they are and what they value. The techniques refined in a small town in Arkansas now operate on a scale that even Edmund, with his grandiose visions, could scarcely have imagined. And few among those influenced by these methods will ever recognize the hand that guides their thinking, for the true mastery of manipulation lies in leaving no trace of itself. And as for those who might dismiss this tale as mere historical curiosity, consider this. The techniques of manipulation and deception documented in the Mason case have only grown more sophisticated in the intervening years. In our modern world of carefully curated identities and digital personas, the question that haunted Harrison in 1857 has become only more relevant. How well do we truly know those who claim to be our neighbors, our friends, or even our family? The Mason brothers may be long gone, but the silence they left behind, the space where trust once existed, continues to echo through time, a warning that the most dangerous predators are not those who threaten our bodies, but those who invade our minds with whispered lies that sound so much like truth. In a final disturbing coda to this story, it should be noted that several researchers who have delved deeply into the Mason case have reported experiencing strange phenomena during and after their investigations. Some describe sudden doubts about memories they had always trusted implicitly. Others report encounters with individuals who seem unnaturally interested in their research and who possess knowledge about the case that has never been publicly disclosed. Most concerning are the reports of subtle alterations to research notes and recordings, changes that the researchers themselves cannot account for and often do not notice until long after they have occurred. Pages that contained specific quotes from Edmund's journals are discovered to be blank. Audio recordings of interviews with Harrison residents contain gaps or alternate versions of conversations the researchers clearly recall conducting differently. Dr. Walsh herself reported such occurrences during the final stages of her research. I know what I wrote in my analysis of the mechanical device found at the Mason property, she stated in an interview shortly before her sudden retirement from academic life in 1974. I described it as having 13 gears arranged in a specific pattern. Yet, when I reviewed my notes yesterday, I found that I had written 17 gears in a circular arrangement. This discrepancy might seem minor, but it represents exactly the kind of subtle reality shift that Edmund Mason specialized in creating, small enough to make the subject doubt their own memory rather than suspect external manipulation. Whether these reports represent actual interference, the psychological effects of prolonged engagement with disturbing material, or simply the inevitable inconsistencies that occur in any complex research project, remains an open question. What is certain is that the Mason case continues to exert a peculiar influence on those who study it, an influence that seems to blur the boundaries between historical investigation and personal experience, between objective fact and subjective perception. And perhaps that is the most enduring legacy of Edmund and Thomas Mason, the creation of a narrative so layered with deception and revelation, truth and fabrication, that it becomes impossible to determine where one ends and the other begins. In this uncertainty lies the essence of their art, the ability to transform reality itself into a hall of mirrors where every reflection contains both truth and distortion, and where the observer can never be entirely certain which is which. The Mason brothers may have disappeared from Harrison in 1857, but the questions they raised about the nature of identity, memory, and trust remain hauntingly relevant. In a world increasingly dominated by competing narratives and alternative facts, their story serves as both warning and prophecy, a glimpse into the vulnerability of the human mind to manipulation and the fragility of the social bonds that depend on our shared understanding of reality. As you consider this historical account, perhaps from the safety of your own home in a different time and place, it might be worth asking yourself, how certain are you of the memories that define your sense of self? How confident are you in your ability to distinguish truth from falsehood when presented by a skilled and convincing narrator? And how would you know if someone had already begun to rewrite your understanding of reality, one subtle suggestion at a time? Or in the final analysis, the most terrifying aspect of the Mason case is not what it tells us about two malevolent brothers in 19th century Arkansas, but what it reveals about the precariousness of our own grip on reality, and the ease with which that grip might be loosened by those who understand the architecture of belief.